delighted to have with me two people who can probably shed more light on the future of education than many others in this country. While we will talk about the pandemic, like Sunetra mentioned, much of our focus will be on the new educational policy and the way forward. For those of you who might need a refresher on this, India recently came out with a new education policy. Dr. Kasturirangan was the chairperson of the committee that brought out that document. It is a visionary document with far-reaching changes. It's received a lot of acclaim. It's been critiqued in parts, and it focuses on some very, very interesting areas, which I hope over the next half an hour to 45 minutes we will be able to discuss. But before that, I want to start off with an easy question for both of you. It's like, you know, an opening ball in a cricket over, slow full toss outside a half stump. COVID. Suppose you had to envision education in the time of COVID, and this is clearly a black swan event. I mean, it's something that no one could have predicted. It's something that no one expected to happen. Sure, there were projections that said like the next pandemic was never too far away, but no one thought that it would happen now. But suppose you had to build an education infrastructure, a larger framework, say, that would be resilient to this. What are the one or two things that you would do? Dr. Kasturirangan, can we start with you, please?
Well, first of all, thank you, Sukumar and also Hindustan Times for this unique privilege of interacting. Regarding the situation with regard to the COVID, there are two things that I would like to say. One is, of course, we need to address the question of technology, because these are things that happen with short time frames, and short time frames to develop mathematical tools, scientific, we need to address the use of technology. And if you look at address the use of technology, the question is with regard to the problem this country faces in the context of technology, the digital divide. This is pretty severe in the context of this. We have done quite a lot of things were done even before COVID on various aspects that became very prominent, like online learning, the question of blended education and things of that kind. But I think they need to be strengthened. The evaluation has shown that there are strengths in them, but there are also questions in them. And lastly, there are also weaknesses in them. And therefore, we have to address this. One thing it has shown is certain areas we can certainly transform our current systems into a normal mode, which we have learned out of the COVID. On the other side, we have established, for example, a new forum called the National Educational Technology Forum. And this forum can really debate, it's a deliberative platform, should debate the futuristic aspects of technology. There are many disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, expert systems and things like that. The evaluation of them, their suitability for this country, adaptability, and the economics and all the rest of it. I think it opens up a large area of research, development, evaluation, field evaluation. I think this is something that as good as happened, things will get accelerated. The policy itself makes a very specific recommendation with respect to this. These two things on the technology, evaluation of technology, and the coupling it with education. These are the things that I would like to say at this stage. Of course, there are the questions regarding the social part of it, the cultural part of it, whether a youngster studying in school, is it the best way to have an online education where you ultimately the man is a social animal. If you don't meet eye to eye with your teacher, there are serious problems. So are we addressing this question? There are questions in this kind of a thing. We need to do research. We need to understand it. I think it's a matter which is a little open, even though there is a lot of debate with regard to the online access of education for the youngsters, especially the middle school and the primary school kind of a thing. Are we doing the right thing with respect to the way in which they would like to interact and learn from the teacher? The whole education policy also in the early phase is an interactive process. It is not. It doesn't assume that you learn something out of looking at the video. There is an interactive process. So this need to be assessed with respect to the technology in the school education. But there is a strength in the higher education. And I think the research is also a potential on which we can use the technology. Thank you.
Ashish, your comments?
Yeah, firstly, COVID is a complete black swan event. it has meant that most children will actually lose a year and they'll fall behind. So it's a tragic event as far as education is concerned. Couldn't have really planned for it because this is a once in 100-year event. I think it reminds us that firstly, despite the hype of technology, the truth is children will always be going to school. I mean, school is much more than just sitting at home and learning online, as Dr. Kasturirangan was saying. And so that's one, the primacy of physical education, and that EdTech at the end of the day will be supplementary. How could we have been better prepared? I think if we think of a home-based, we have historically not reached out to parents. So if you look at most government school teachers, they don't even have the numbers of parents, they can't reach out to them, etc. I think what COVID has done is it's forced teachers to reach out to parents. It's forced the government to think about an omni-channel approach because not everybody has access to a smartphone. So radio, TV, etc. It's forced us to think about, do we have enough digital content in the vernacular? And is it mapped against a learning outcome framework? So this whole idea of a home-based curriculum, that can I send something on a daily or weekly or twice a week, videos for children to watch, activities for them to do, etc. We were caught off guard. We didn't have this. And remember, most children in India are learning asynchronously. It's only in the upper income households where there's Zoom or synchronous education. I think the flip side is coming out of this. One, there's a silver lining. One is we have a better connect between teachers and parents. They now have engaged with parents much more than ever before. They have their numbers to text message, WhatsApp, and we can take advantage of this channel, I believe, to build like a home-based tech-driven curriculum. The ISRO report shows that 61% of households in rural India now use WhatsApp. And I bet it's 90+% in urban India. And you can mark my words that in 2 years, the number will be 90% in rural India. So we have a real opportunity here to send parents material for them to do with their children, for children to do practice, fun activities, etc. Let's not lose this opportunity. Let's build on this to build a home-based curriculum. And the second thing is, in this COVID moment, it is very interesting that a lot of state governments have actually done a lot of teacher professional development online or in blended form. And I think we can do this in blended form going forward. We had incubated a program called Teacher App, and you won't believe it, that in this period, we have had more than 1 million teachers take 5+ courses online. And this is something that would never have happened before. So I think we can reimagine continuous professional development. Again, it'll be blended, not just online. And we can reimagine this home-based curriculum using technology.
Thank you, Ashish. I think some of those points were very well made, and thank you, Dr. Kasturirangan. I think the interesting thing, and this also gives me an opportunity to sort of segue into NEP, which I want to be the thrust of our discussion today. If we'd actually done some of the things that NEP had mentioned, it might have actually addressed a few of these issues that we are facing right now. Especially in terms of teacher preparation, especially in terms of digitization, especially in terms of the availability of material, across languages. So I want to move into NEP now. And one of the very interesting areas that NEP focuses is on assessments. And there, India is a particularly interesting case, right? I mean, there is so much of thrust on examinations, which means that you would expect it to be a very, very result-oriented and an outcome-oriented approach. But yet, when you look at some of the ASER readings, there are still so many fundamental outcomes that are lagging. And there are children who are in grade 5 who can't even do a grade 2 problem in mathematics or can't compose a sentence that people in a lesser class should ideally be able to do. How do you think this problem can be addressed? Dr. Kasturirangan, I'll start with you, please.
Well, you talked about assessment. And what I would like to start with is the fact that the national education policy really is a transformative policy, an end-to-end policy, and it starts with the preschool education right down to the research and PhD and things of that kind. And in this process, we had to relook at the entire process, and particularly if you come to the school education, the question was, are we doing the right thing with respect to the various grades or stages of studies in the school education? What is the basis for that? If you do that part of it and go a little more detailed in the form of science or neural sciences or cognitive science, you come to the conclusion that the present early part of the education, for example, of the youngsters, are mistuned with respect. It is not in tune with the kind of neurological development, the brain development that a child experiences in the early phase. It is said that by the age of 8, 82% of the brain is already developed. And do we address the question of the ability of the child to learn in an extraordinary way in this period with respect to the type of education we are imparting to that child? This is where the earlier part of the education had a serious difficulty. Its implications are several. One is the fact is that we have to really rush through a process of learning which includes language and mathematics, for example, literacy and numeracy. And we need to see whether how much we can pack in this first 8 years of the child's growth. That is the first part of it. The second part of it is every child in this, we all always assume there is a linear way in which the child learns. So if a youngster who is 6 years old, all the 6-year-olds learn to the same extent. It is not so. The brain development is not uniform among the youngsters. We don't address this question. So the early part of the first 5 years, which we call the foundational period, we have addressed it with respect to the fact that you deal with a perceptual thing, and this perceptual thing has to be addressed with respect to individual attention. And though it needs a new way of making sure that the youngster grasps things, whether it is on literacy or whether it is in numeracy. In fact, language can be best learned in this period. So this is one important thing. And if you factor this aspect of it and you use the same thing to look at the rest of the developmental stage, so it is the developmentally appropriate education that we are giving as a proposal, which is related to the 5-year and 3-year and 3-year and 4 years. And if this is the kind of a thing, the primary purpose of the assessment has to be formative. How is the child really learning and how well is he tuned to the kind of thing that he is supposed to understand. This is where we find that the primary assessment, which is to be a learning, has to necessarily go from the present practice of a summative assessment, and your assessment is based on the summative assessment, which is an assessment of learning. And it includes, therefore, examinations and other graded work. You have to go to a formative assessment, which is assessment for learning, which helps teacher identify exactly where the students are struggling. So this is the difference, the summative and the formative. This is the other part of it, which has been now factored into with the assessment, where we have to shift it to the study in the formative mode. The students will be tested for higher order skill analysis, critical thinking and conceptual clarity, greater attention to this, and ultimately, of course, the teachers have to be trained for this kind of a thing in making use. The last point I would like to make on this is that here the teachers' autonomy with respect to dealing with the curriculum and the pedagogy is also critical. We have discussed this question with respect to how, even though we may have a curriculum and a pedagogy coming out of a curricular framework which is formed for the country, we certainly have to adopt it depending on the teacher's experience. This is not present. Once you don't have that autonomy for the teacher, what happens is he just picks up the examination that comes from one place, evaluates it according to another rule. There is nothing called an assessment. You just try to check up how much the fellow has road memory he has carried with him and how well is he doing that part of it. This is what is not expected. So obviously the formative part of it has to take over, and this also needs a special effort on our side to make sure the teachers are adept in evaluating the formative part of it, and that is not a single shot process, it is a multi-stage process.
Dr. Kasturirangan, quick follow-up. 0 to 8, from what you've just said, and also what the policy says, the first 8 years are clearly going to be the most critical. And that is also where clearly a lot of change needs to happen. Not just in terms of the curriculum, but also in terms of how the teachers approach the whole process. And probably a lot of involvement of the parents is also involved at this stage. Would that be an accurate reading of this?
Yes, this is a phase in which, for example, the policy says that the learning starts right from the day 0 the child is born. 0 to 3 is within home. There is some prescriptions of what should be done at home. We want to optimize the learning process at home, and there are very traditional, interesting ways in which the Indian families do adopt certain type of things for the 0 to 3. The 3 to 8 is critical. The most important aspect of the criticality is the ability to have certain types of, for example, this is going to be you are addressing really the problem with respect to a non-structured environment. It is not because it is not linear, as I mentioned. So you need to have specialized activity-based, play-based kind of a thing, which will kindle the neuropsychological capability of the brain and give it an optimal thing. And the same thing, that's why importance is also given right from the age 3 in terms of language learning, something which was postponed to 6 years. Now it's good. The education starts at the age of 3, and the 3 in the language, mathematics, so literacy and numeracy comes into picture in this particular thing, and then followed by the question of making sure that all through the primary education and the higher education, we continue with the literacy numeracy concept in some form or other. So that is the other part of it. And then, of course, once you go through the 5 years, the next 3 years will be a broader understanding of the learning process with the limited interface with the text. And then you go to a region where you are able to look at the subject separately. And finally, you are able to make even a comprehension of what you are planning for, what you are learning, what is its use, and what could be what you want to be. That is the last 4 years. So it is structured in this way in which every stage has got a certain reason to why it is so with respect to the educational levels and the type of education that is imparted. The role of community, the role of parents, the role of teachers, these are all critical because of the fact that ultimately it is not going to be a progress sheet in the sense of mark sheets. It is going to be a totality of what the student is. That the future for report cards are going to be much more elaborate. And this is where the importance of parents, ability of parents to evaluate it, try to go to school and get a feedback from the school. This whole process has to be set in motion. So I think every important stakeholder of the community will have a say in the overall context of school education in the coming years.
Ashish, to come back to the original question that I posed, which was on outcomes.
Yeah, so I think firstly, I want to congratulate Dr. Kasturirangan. I think this is a landmark document and policy. And we look back and say that this really changed the trajectory of India's education system, because earlier it was about access and equity. Now we are really focused on outcomes and quality. I also want to mention what you said earlier, which is the primacy of foundational literacy and numeracy, which Dr. Kasturirangan talked about. These are the critical years. And, you know, there is a certain point, which is at age 8, you switch from learning to read to reading to learn. And if you miss that boat, you miss it forever, because the curriculum moves on. And, you know, you just sit there in the classroom and everything goes over your head. Your learning trajectory flattens. So as a country, we need to be sharply focused. And this is what the policy clearly says, that this is a #1 priority. It needs to be in mission mode. By 2025, we need to get there. And I'm so glad that the government, the first thing that they have done coming out of the policy is actually announced this mission called the Nipun Bharat mission. The Prime Minister actually announced this shortly after Teachers' Day to all teachers. And the Prime Minister himself actually set a goal saying that children should be reading at the rate of 30 to 35 words per minute, which in technical jargon is known as oral reading fluency, by age 8 or class 3. So that really, the Prime Minister has defined what the outcome or the goal is. And oral reading fluency is not sufficient. You also need reading with comprehension, but the two are tightly joined at the hip. So I think that's the goal that the country needs to shoot for, where we need every child in this country to be able to read, write, and do basic arithmetic. I completely agree with Dr. Kasturirangan that the assessment needs to be, we need to focus on formative. We need to give the teacher the right tools so that she can assess children regularly and lift the bottom half. We will only improve our overall if we can lift the bottom. Focusing on the top 10 or 20% is not going to help us achieve our objectives. And we will know where to remediate through this assessment. Of course, there is a summative assessment as well. As part of this mission, there will be a baseline next year, a midline, and an end line in 2025. That's critical. But there's no point of reform if the classroom transaction doesn't change. At the end of the day, if that doesn't change, there is no reform. And so that's at the very, very core. And then beyond that, you talked about assessment reform. I think the policy also talks about reform in the higher grades, particularly class 10, class 12 board exam. And I think that's fundamental as well in terms of moving away from rote learning. And believe you me, I think this will have a huge cascade effect downwards into middle school and primary school. Because the board exams are a certain way, parents start getting their children and schools start getting the children hooked onto rote-based learning from very early on. So I think fixing that in the higher grades also will have a huge washback or cascade effect downward. And then institutionalizing it through Parak, I think will be a game changer. We need a body. If you look at all countries in the world that have successful education systems, they have a technical body that actually does this. And the policy proposes exactly that. So I think this is a landmark policy. And I'm so glad that the government is actually following through with it. Parak is being established. The Foundational Literacy and Numeracy mission has been put forward. And even class 10 and 12 board exam, at least CBSE, is now considering it. So I think the ball is moving forward.
I'm not going to make a quick digression into two areas which have obviously got a lot of press because both of them are a little controversial. One of them is the whole languages thing, right? I mean, because at some point, any conversation on education, you start talking about languages, and then there are clearly states that have their own views on this. Some of the southern states I've traditionally see this as a way of the center of imposing Hindi on them when it shouldn't be there. And it's one of those endemic things. And a lot of it is political, but I wanted your views on this, on languages. And while we're talking about schools, the interesting thing is we're having this conversation on a day when, I don't know whether you saw this morning's Hindustan Times, where the education minister actually had a piece on the use of languages in higher education. And I thought it was an interesting piece. And I thought we could probably, once we talk about schools, talk a little bit about that also. Dr. Kasturirangan?
Yeah, I think you have very aptly touched upon a very, it's more than a sensitive subject. I want to first Number 3, the language in the policy is dealt with based on considerations beyond what the general perception is. The language is dealt with respect to the ability to learn, the importance of mastering a few languages, the ability to build on that capability, and the necessity to on side appreciate the language richness of this country, the importance of learning languages for our international global role and things of that kind. So the whole scope of the policy framework that we have presented on languages is one which is a composite of these elements, in which the language at the school stage comes into picture, into focus for one reason. It is not that the 3-language formula is new, it was there in the previous this thing also. We have not changed the 3-language formula, number 1. Number 2, the content of the 3-language formula, it was supposed to be only the local languages that were considered as a part of the language formula. Now it has got widened up. into a larger number. So you are really covering more number of languages as a flexibility for you to learn. The third is the ability for the child to learn languages. As I said, 3 years to 8 years is extremely critical, not only for the numeracy, but for the literacy also. The language learning is very critical at that point. They have found out that if you try to stimulate those parts of the brain where the language location is there, then they grow faster. Their ability to absorb additional inputs about the language and its structure and its all the scientific elements of the language is much better done, and it also is carried forward. By the age of 8, you are able to pick up more number of languages in the later years. Actually, by investing a little more number of languages in the early years, you are also investing for a longer period with a larger number of languages. If you want to learn Japanese much later, probably if you had put enough time and enough effort into the language learning in the early phase, it has its implications. So these are the considerations. 3-language formula is something we have adopted. We give it a more flexibility, and we also know that it's a flexible because you don't have to two of the languages has to be Indian language. Number one. Out of the 2 Indian languages, one has to be the local language, mother tongue, home language, or it could be regional language or local language. This is the other part of the thing. And then you can have English or any other language, whichever you want to choose, and you can start it right from the beginning at the age of 3. So there is absolutely no inhibition to learn what you want to learn. You have a 3-language formula because 3 languages is the minimum the brain which should be respected for its capability. We should not do it at 2 or 1 because we are highly suboptimal with respect to nature's gift, which we should not allow that. That is the reason for it. And ultimately, that the language formula is based on these considerations of science, considerations of pragmatism, and also the country's richness on language is the last point I would like to make. Ultimately, if you know, in the last 50, 60 years, we have lost about 220, 230 languages. That is a kind of a way in which it is disappearing because of non-use of these kind of languages. We have at least the 22 languages of the 8th schedule have to be properly preserved. Even that is not that well managed in terms of education, in terms of its utilization, in terms of further research in these languages. Then there are a set of classical languages, which also are extremely, whether it is all the 4 South Indian languages or Pali or that kind of a thing, that is the other part of it. And then there is this, the classical modern languages. And then you have the classical language like Sanskrit. And Sanskrit is always looked up in a very different context. If you really look at the richness of the Sanskrit, it contains much more richness than Latin and Greek put together. That is the heritage of Sanskrit, dating back to millennia. And that culture, we need to, and culture and language are related, and therefore we need to make sure that by learning language, especially language like Sanskrit, you are enriching your system not only with respect to Sanskrit, the entire heritage and culture of this country. And I think as India grows, becomes economically strong, it's culturally, it's very important for us to make sure that this country's rich cultural heritage is properly understood and appreciated first by Indians themselves before we also throw it out to them. This entire purpose is all very well described with respect to the language. We need to have a translation system, interpretation system, learning system, good departments in education, both in school and higher education, where we need to create school of languages. And lastly, the ability to learn also foreign languages. We are very poor. The number of foreign language specialization available in this country is just it's better that it's not too much elaborated beyond the fact that it's highly unsatisfactory. Thank you.
Ashish, you want to add anything to what Dr. Kasturirangan said?
Yeah, all I'll say is firstly, I think all research shows that children should learn in the mother tongue if they want to acquire language skills. And it's common sense. I mean, you know, every child learns oral language to listen and to speak. That comes naturally just in the home because you're surrounded by the language, right? But you know that reading and writing are extremely hard to learn because you have to translate sound into, you know, something artificial, which is a written language that we have constructed. And that takes a lot of work. And if it's a language you're not exposed to at home, if you can't speak the language, if you don't have a vocabulary, it is much harder to acquire the language. So for that reason alone, we are already falling behind, like you said. I mean, it is absolutely critical that children learn in the mother tongue. Now, in some elite schools, if they learn English, that's fine. The parents already speak English. They may be speaking to them in English. That's a narrow universe. But if you look at UP, where it's largely Hindi that's spoken, and there's some variants as well, it is critical that they learn in Hindi or whatever the home language may be, and then transitioning to Hindi, which is the regional language. So I think it's absolutely critical. And then as Dr. Kasturirangan was saying also, that from a cultural perspective as well, it is absolutely critical that we preserve our languages. But in the early years, the evidence is clear. I know some states and some governments that said, let's introduce English first, make English the first language. That doesn't make sense. Actually, you're much better off introducing English a little bit later, and allocating that time to learning the mother tongue. Have 3 periods a day for mother tongue. Learn to read first, and then it's much easier to switch to L2 thereafter.
The second sensitive issue that I was referring to was private education, because it's one of those things that we are very, very nervous about, or we don't like to talk about it too much. Yet, like we were discussing the other day, Ashish and Dr. Kasturirangan, a lot of schools, even in smaller towns, are really private schools. The challenge is improving education or effectively implementing a policy like this isn't just about working with governments, state governments. It's also about providing some sort of incentives for private schools to really do these things. And Ashish, I'll come to you first. What do you think can be done in this area?
Yeah, so at Central Square Foundation, we primarily work with government schools, but then we look at the system and say, and we actually just put out a report on this, which is a very objective report, which is that 47.5% of children in the school system in India now go to either unaided or aided private schools. So almost half. In 16 states in India, 50% or more of the children go to private schools. So, the train has left the station. I don't think we can unwind the clock. I think if we care about all our children, I care about all our children. I want, whether the child is in private school or government school, we want them to acquire the foundational literacy and numeracy skills. We want them to succeed in life. So I think we need to look at the private system and say that, look, they play a role. I don't think we should, there should be much greater transparency within the private system. I wouldn't call them bad actors. Some are bad actors, but I think many of them are actually doing a service to children. But we should give them greater autonomy. So lower the regulation, get rid of the license Raj, but we should insist on greater autonomy and greater transparency and greater accountability from them as well, so that parents are informed and have proper data before they decide where their children should go to school. I think it's also important to think about the incentives we create for private school owners to want to improve their schools. Right now, if you look just for household effects, actually private schools don't perform too much better than government schools. And so I really think that, and it's partly because what they're showing is that the fact that the teacher shows up and there's greater accountability, or there's a computer in the school, etc. So I think it's very, very important that we create the right incentives for them. And the last point I'd like to make is we must remember that the private schools we think of are not the private schools of India. 70% of children go to schools where the fees are 1,000 rupees or less per month. 45% of children go to schools where the fees are 500 rupees per month or lower. These are budget private schools, and average school size about 200 children. And so it's these schools, often, these ramshackle schools, which really we need to figure out a way for them to improve quality as well. And this is a real challenge going forward. But we need to carry them along and create the right incentives and ensure that transparency exists, because we want all children to succeed.
Kasturirangan, role of private sector. role of private schools, private colleges? What is your view on this?
Well, first of all, I should say that Ashish beautifully summarized the issues related to this, and he has really clarified many things. In fact, the policy is in tune with the kind of things that Ashish mentioned about the outlook for the private schools. I want to say one important thing. First is on the regulatory framework, we have brought the private school and public schools at the same level. There is an even-handedness we deal with. We are not dealing with them separately. This is the most important thing we should say. Then the regulatory aspects, if we take away from inputs to outcomes, there is no reason why whatever is the thing that will improve the quality of the private school, that will automatically should come in, and this is an expectation. And if one looks at all the kind of light but tight part of it, and the parameters that are now specified what the public school should have, whether things like whether the safety, security, probity in finances, or sound process of governance, they are applicable to both. If you just do it, and the only thing is, as Ashish rightly mentioned, it has to be transparent. It is in the public domain. And of course, then there are many things which are common to all the schools. TET qualification is critical. Elevating the teachers of the school teachers to higher educational institutions so far as getting the BEd and other qualifications are concerned. And then most importantly, I also want to say that the policy allows you to share the resources between public institutions and private institutions. So there can be agreement on this. So all the policy has given enough thought to make sure that public school and private school can compete on even grounds together. And then the effort on the government system will be to make sure that we make the public school as a best place to go, as good as what if there is a perception with regard to the private school. But that gives an incentive also to the private school to make sure that they come up to this the other side. So on the whole, I want to say, and I agree with Ashish, that there is no difference that we have made in the policy with respect to private. And even though there are conflicting interpretation to this policy, I want to use this forum to say that some saying that there is a privatization that the policy supports, and then there is other part, the group says that under the support for the public institutions, the private is neglected. I think neither is true. I think it's a very balanced and very well nuanced policy. And we have given a lot of thought to this question because we knew it will come up. We, in fact, posed the question first before formulating the policy. Thank you.
We are almost out of time, but I want to raise another issue, which is a critical part of what the policy says. And this is about the FIUP and the integration of education at the college level, right? I mean, where you want to sort of broad base college education, at least in the initial years. Dr. Kasturirangan, your views on this, please.
The most important thing about the thing is that we have wanted because the debate is with respect to whether we should go for a holistic and a multidisciplinary education. The present context, we call it as a liberal education. And what do we do about the liberal education? Now, there are enough amount of evidence with regard to the multidisciplinary courses, which Ashoka does quite a lot of this kind of a thing. Then there are also areas where multidisciplinary work has been done, but not as a part of the education, but as a program. I myself headed a thing on the Western Ghats, which needed all kinds of inputs coming into it. It is not really an environmental issue, not a forest issue. It was not a financial issue, developmental issue, cultural issue, social. So you can see the dimensions in which we need to address. I think today's graduates who come out of the colleges do not have the ability to look at it in a comprehensive fashion. You need to have the ability to integrate knowledges of different dimensions and come to a conclusion which is the real situation, because by leaving out some of the dimensions in the analysis, the conclusions can be very misleading. So the whole idea is to create a method of more creative, understand the complex problem that we are faced with even at the undergraduate level, and the way the job seekers are also looking for. Today, the job providers, they not only ask for a very in-depth understanding of a particular subject, they also look at the ability of dealing with that in-depth subject in the broader dimensions of other areas. And that is becoming more and more important. Keeping all this in mind, we have recommended this thing with respect to the undergraduate education, a 4-year education which will fulfill this kind of a thing. There will be what you may call as a the liberal education. You can have the majors and minors, things kind of a thing. Exiting and entry policy also has been made flexible with respect to this four, and most importantly also the what you may call it the professional education, and also the skill education. Both of them have been also brought into the higher education system, and you can have a bachelor of vocational education, and you can have also the professional education in the long run, whether it is medicine, whether it is law or agriculture, should form a part of this total educational ecosystem. This is the totality of what we have recommended. It has to go in stages, but integration of subjects and ability to create a holistic and multidisciplinary approach to education at the undergraduate level will be the most critical in the immediate future.
Thank you very much. I think we can go on and on. I mean, there are several issues I've not touched upon. I've not touched on governance. I've not touched on vocational education, but we are out of time. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I do hope we get to sit down with the two of you again and discuss some of these issues.